it when everyone was here, but I want to cover live effects today. And live effects are something that's included in Illustrator that really allows you to do some cool stuff with design. Who remembers the drop shadow and outer glow stuff we did? Right, you guys remember that? That was on the skier poster, and that was a type of live effect. Well, there are many that you can do, that many different things that Illustrator offers you. So again, I'm going to start off with simple shapes, nothing overly complex. A rectangle is kind of a good place to start for most of these things. I've got because I had just drawn a rectangle or a shape with a red stroke and a white fill. That's what Illustrator gave me this time. I'm going to go ahead and reverse those by hitting the Shift X key. Shift X will reverse I think I've demonstrated that before, but Shift X reverses the two colors that you have. So if that happens to you and you're like, oh, I actually want a black fill on that instead of a black stroke, you can swap those. I don't mind my white line, but I'll make it disappear by hitting the / key, and that gets rid of the white. And the reason that worked is because my stroke icon is at the foreground. So by hitting the / key, it made that fill with none. Okay, so to find live effects, they're in the effects dropdown. That's where they all exist. We won't be going into 3D today because that's actually for a future lesson. 3D's you can build and create 3D objects in Illustrator. Really nicely rendered ones. Not quite at the level that you might get in a true ray tracing 3D application, but you can certainly get some nice effects in Illustrator. But I'll demonstrate real quick at least the convert to shape effect. We're familiar with this a little bit in that stylizing and rounding corners really produces similar results. But what I'm going to do is I have just a square here, just a rectangle with right-angled corners. And if I go to the effect drop-down and then the convert to shape option, and I come out here to rounded rectangle, it gives me a slightly different dialog box than what we see in when we're using the stylized rounded corners feature. But it essentially does the same thing with an additional option, and you can actually make and it's always a good idea with these live effects to hit preview as soon as it opens. And I wish Illustrator could change that default so that preview is just always on, or at least it remembered what you did last time and made that consistent. But you can see here now by previewing, I've added rounded corners to the square, and it's added an extra width of a 1/4 inch and an extra height of a 1/4 inch. I can change these attributes to 0 in both of those, and then it just applies, if you can see slightly here, the rounded corner radius of 1/8 of an inch. To accentuate that a bit, I'll go ahead and make it a 1/4 inch, and we should be able to see that better. So you can see now that this shape has been converted to visually represent a rounded corner object. But if we go into outline view, you'll see that it indeed is still a square. So it's just an effect that's been applied to that object. You can do the same thing here with converting to circles, and if it's a circle, convert to rectangle, and so on. So that's a quick demonstration on Command Y. Brings us back to preview mode, and again, Command Y will just toggle outline and preview mode. The next effect, and I'll go ahead and undo that actually, just to get rid of our effect here. So we're back to a rectangle. We just don't start layering too many effects on top. Crop marks are a way for you to produce crop marks on your artwork if you need to within your artboard. So all that, and this will make more sense to you a little bit later on when I show you guys how to print crop marks and how to use them to trim your artwork out. But basically, if you want to, you have to have an object selected. And if you want to create crop marks around it, you can just hit the crop marks effects, and you can see now it's created crop marks that I can use. If I print this out, I'll know exactly what edge to trim that artwork to. So that's what that does.
Wait, why would you do that?
Well, a lot of times, you might be working on an artboard like this, and let's just say, I'll show you here. I'm going to do something where I've got command or copy, paste, and back, and I'll create a duplicate of this object behind it and make it bigger. Okay, so now I've got two orange squares on top of each other. So I want to create a bleed effect inside of my artwork, right? So what I can do is click on my inner square and then go to crop marks, and then now I've got the crop marks referencing where I want to trim this square out to if I print it out, right? And I still get a full bleed effect, so that color goes all the way to the edges. As I demonstrated earlier, doing crop marks right to this, yeah, it doesn't really help you much, because if you have a blade and you're still trying to trim along that edge and there's no bleed, you might get some of the white of the paper, which is typically not what you want. So I don't know if that explains a lot more, Craig. Does that kind of answer your question a little bit? It'll make a little more sense when we actually, a little bit later on, when we go to print out some sample artwork that I have to show you guys how to use those crop marks to trim out your artwork using a knife and a straight edge. So going back to the our rectangle, this starts to get fun. How many of you have already used some of these distort and transform effects? Anyone use that in your artwork yet? A little bit, Craig?
I played around with it.
Yeah. If you guys want to explore, the one I use the most is roughen, and I'll show you in a second. But just to jump through these real quick, free distort allows you to, it brings up a separate window, and it allows you to just kind of freely distort your artwork. Now, this is a rectangle, and so there's not a whole lot of fancy business that I can do that I couldn't do just by doing a direct selection tool. But you can certainly use this. I still have my square back there. I just applied that exact free transform to that object using the free transform filter. Now, the difference here, I guess, between this method and using just grabbing the corners using the direct selection tool is that our rectangle is still preserved, even though it looks totally different. Again, if we go to outline view, you can see it's still a rectangle. It still has its original properties. It's just that an effect has been applied to it. All right, so I'll undo that, and I'll get rid. I still have two squares stacked on top of each other, so I'll get rid of that other one. And I'll jump over to the, well, let me show you this pucker and bloat, because that one's kind of funny. Pucker and bloat is, it kind of does what it says, really. Again, by hitting the preview key, you can see that with a rectangle, if I go to the bloat side, it's going to start to bloat the straight edges of my artwork and converge the corners. And obviously, the more complex your shape is, it's going to have different types of effects. But here's one way to quickly create sort of this four-petaled flower effect using a rectangle and the bloat effect. If I go the other way, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to converge the line segments and extend the corner points. And you can see now I've sort of created this four-pointed star effect. So there's some fun stuff that you might be able to use, especially when it comes to these kinds of stars in your design. So I'm going to hit cancel to go back to not apply any of that and go back. The roughen filter is pretty neat, and the reason I say that, actually, let me cancel that. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little better, and let me go back to the roughen filter. The roughen filter can be really nice because one of the things that makes Adobe Illustrator not as cool as Photoshop, right, is that it's got these really hard edges. Adobe Illustrator, for the most part, if you just jump into it without getting really creative, you get hard edges and solid flat color. That's kind of the default when you first start drawing shapes. Well, in some cases, you might want to add a slightly different edge to your line work or your shape, and the roughen filter can help do that, create sort of more of a textured edge. So if I open up the roughen palette, the default's 5% with a 10 points per inch effect, and if I hit preview, I'll see what that does. Right now it's just randomly created this roughen pattern around the outside of my shape, and that still looks pretty blocky, but what's nice is you can get really small with this. You can actually go less than 1% and do let's say 0.2%, 0.2, and then you can increase the detail here. Let's go ahead and go to 90, jump up really high. I'm going to bump this up maybe to 0.4 and see where I get. And now, if I hit OK on that, you can see I've kind of gotten this really nice, slightly roughened edge that gives just that element of texture to the design that you might desire for some of the elements in your project. Any questions on that?
It's like artwork.
What's that? It looks more like artwork. It's starting to look like a Rothko square instead of just an Illustrator thing there. That's kind of a couple of the filters that I like to use. But this is basically an overview. I just want to introduce you to some of this stuff. Another one that I use from the distort and transform is the zigzag. But the zigzag is most effective, I think, when you have a straight line. So I have a line here. I'm going to swap the colors because I have a none fill on my stroke, and then Shift X will swap those immediately for me. I'll go ahead and thicken them up by applying a 4-point stroke out of the stroke panel. Of course, you can also do that up here in the control panel. And now I can apply the zigzag filter to this, and it should create a nice zigzag line for me. The beauty of this is you can start the nice thing about applying effects to your vector objects is that you can use these to start your design, and as you get more intricate, more layers to your design, you may realize, oh, that zigzag's not quite enough, right? So you can always go back into the artwork and change it. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. So I'll go ahead and apply this, and now I have this subtle zigzag applied to that line. You can see that it's still selected, and Illustrator still considers it a straight path, although the effect of that zigzag has now been applied. If I go over to the appearance panel and open that up, as we became familiar with this last week, you'll see that in the appearance panel, here's that zigzag effect being applied. I can just click on this title, and it brings that dialog box back up, and I can increase the number of ridges so I get way more zigs and zags in my artwork. Any questions on that? Some new stuff there for you guys? Might give you some inspiration for logo design, pattern design, and other things. Twist is kind of a cool feature. Christian, I think I saw you playing with that one. And Twist, allows you sort of to create this. It doesn't work that well on rectangles, on pointed things. It does a really nice job, but you can see that it's starting to actually sort of forcefully twist that shape. So all of these do something slightly different, and I encourage you to explore those under the distort and transform effects when you're working on your designs. Pathfinders, these are going to do the same things that your Pathfinder panel does. I prefer to use my Pathfinder panel because I find it very comforting to see the little icon as opposed to trying to remember the name of all of the Pathfinders, but that's what that is. Rasterize, you really don't need to use all that often. What that does is it turns your vector artwork into raster artwork or bitmap, like a Photoshop file. And that may be handy if a printer requires it of you. They say, my printer can't print this stuff out. It keeps coming out cruddy. Your artwork's too fancy. You might need to rasterize it and then resubmit it to them for printing. So that's one that that's not all that exciting, but it is an option if you do need it. Now, stylize is certainly one that I use frequently, and it produces a lot of great effects that that can enhance your artwork. One of them is outer glow, as I demonstrated. Now, if I apply an outer glow, and let me hit the preview, it's taken a while, there it goes. You'll see that because I have a black fill, the outer glow is black, and I think that was left over from the last time I applied an outer glow to my object. And so you can change that color by clicking on this icon, and it brings up the color picker, or of course you can toggle over to your color swatches that are found in your swatches panel. This is just a different way of looking at them. Okay. You can make adjustments to that. The opacity, if I go to multiply and then change this to 100, it will darken it. You can also increase or decrease the blur. I'll go to 0.2 inches, and you'll see now my outer glow, which is dark. It's not a glow. A glow you usually think of something that gets lighter on a darker background, which you can also do. But you'll see that at 0.2 inches now, my glow has expanded even farther. So I'll go ahead and cancel out of that, and I'm going to draw another shape behind this one of a slightly different color. I drew it on top of it, but that's okay. I can Command exit, select my other object, and then Command B to paste them back. Now I'm going to change the color so that I can actually see something going on here. Oops, got a little too excited there. Let me fill it with gray. There we go. So the outer glow, as you might expect, will also produce a glow if you wanted to. You just need to change the color from a black. I can just put it right up here in the top left corner in the color picker, and it will now, let me hit the preview. You'll see now there's a light outer glow, which is more indicative of what the name suggests. And so that can add really nice effects to your artwork, as we've seen already in some of the projects we've worked on, don't hesitate to use these, because especially if you're working with shadows or glows on dark backgrounds, it can really make your artwork pop off of the background. In the old days, I guess not in the old days, and not a lot of people, but I had a professor who called Photoshop photo slop, because back in the day, that's all we students did when we were using it was just, let's see, the most gross looking effects on top of effects on top of effects. So as you guys are probably more savvy than I was back in design school, sometimes subtlety it can be better, right? Subtlety can be a more effective way of producing a more refined looking design. And so, with some of these, you don't want to go too haywire. Keep them, keep them subtle, and you might start to like the fact that that your designs are just looking a little more refined, and that can help. So I'm going to undo that so that I don't have the glow on there anymore, and maybe we can play around with some other effects. SVG filters. Those are SVG is a vector graphic format that is very universal, and these filters do. Whoa, mousy! Here we go. These filters do different things depending on your artwork, and in a lot of these, if I apply them to my vector object, they won't do a whole lot. For instance, this Gaussian blur is pretty nice. It actually created a little feathered blur at the edge of my vector artwork, and the beauty of this is that it's still vector, right? I can still manipulate it like any other vector object and produce a glow. This glow isn't that nice, and you can see it on screen. These colors aren't, the gray and orange aren't combining into each other very well, and that's just an anomaly based on the two colors that are being used here, right? So you're not, you'd have to, use something like this, a Gaussian blur, and be, take into account the effects that it's going to have on your artwork based on the color combination. Any questions on that so far? Everyone kind of following along? We're kind of moving at a quick pace, but I want you guys to feel comfortable into jumping into these effects, because this is where you guys might start seeing, some of your artwork really coming to life on the page. And so there are others that do different things to your artwork. Dilate, for instance, when it comes to this solid flat object, doesn't do a whole lot. But if it was a more complex object with multiple angles and overlay effects and gradients, you might start to see a little more. So these are all things that you're going to kind of have to experiment with depending on the type of artwork that you're working on. Okay. The warp effect. We covered a little of this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and this is where you can really start to have some fun also with tweaking the shape of your object without actually modifying the shape itself. You can always change it later. And so I'm going to start with the arc warp and preview it. And you can see it's taken my rectangle. You can see that rectangle still selected there, and it's actually arced it. Illustrator has forced those edges and the whole shape to curve based on the parameters that I've set here. And obviously, if I change the percentage of the bend, it's going to either reduce or increase, or even kind of convex that shape, go in the opposite direction if I take it towards the negative direction. So this is another neat little tool that you can use for your artwork. If you what's nice about the warp options is once you're in this dialog box, you have a drop down that allows you to explore the rest of them. So the flag one's pretty neat. It allows you to sort of create this flag shape, and you can adjust the the amplitude of those waves and stuff like that by adjusting the sliders accordingly. And you can also tweak it the different directions on the shape too, and really start getting some funky shapes. So another nice little collection of tools to use. And again, the advantage to this being that you can have this shape, you continue your design, modify all this stuff, and then suddenly realize, oh boy, that's not quite right. Well, the beauty of having done this as an effect is you can always go back in and change it later. And again, you do that by going to the appearance panel. Now I have a warp, flag effect as one of the attributes. I can click on that and still adjust that and get something different. So that's the beauty of those effects there. The Photoshop effects, in the lower half you can see there's a line separating the drop-down menu. Photoshop effects are just that. They're actually effects that you'll also find in Photoshop. They're borrowed from Photoshop. They behave much in the same way, and they actually bring up this intricate dialog box when you select one of these. These, like the SVG filters, are not going to have much an effect on your artwork sometimes. A square like this, let's see, we could probably jump into, I'll go ahead and open any one of these, and it'll open up the dialog box. You can see, this colored pencil effect, I had a solid orange color, and Illustrator is trying to make it look like it's a colored pencil drawing, and it just doesn't look like anything, right? So this is not as effective when these Photoshop filters are not as effective when you have vector objects, especially really solid-looking vector objects. Where these filters can come in handy is if you have artwork that you're placing into Illustrator, and I'll go ahead and do that by. I don't think you guys have this file on your computer, but I just want to demonstrate real quick grab the Snowy Mountains shot, and I think it's Lake Tahoe, of course. Oh boy, that's big. Let me close that up a little bit. And now I have a photo, right? I've placed the photo, and you guys are familiar with this process. I know some of you guys got really fancy with your designs. I think Roston, you had the inside of your Lake Tahoe, didn't you? You had a water inside of it. And Tom, you had a lot of photos inside of a shape. You guys were using clipping masks and stuff, and so you're certainly familiar with placing raster artwork in your designs, and raster artwork can also be manipulated in Illustrator much the same way you do in Photoshop. So selecting this image, going to Effect, and then now applying some of these filters will work a lot more like they do in Photoshop. And again, with each one of these, the nice thing is once you're into the Photoshop effects, you have access to all of them. So if you're not happy with how that colored pencil one looks, you can switch over to a different palette knife one, and voila, now you've got this really artistic looking rendition of your artwork. Almost looks like some vector art here. I'm going to apply that and see how it looks, because it looks like it'd be pretty cool. And so you can see it's applied that to my artwork, and now it's still raster. It hasn't converted it to vector. It's still raster, but now it's applied one of those Photoshop effects. There are a lot of effects in there. You probably saw that list was really huge. So again, I encourage you, if you guys, especially, I'll show you later on when you go to work on your logo design project. Presentation is going to be part of it, right? The way you present it on that 8.5 by 11 black piece of paper, and the way the thing's trimmed out and designed is going to enhance the look of your artwork. So you might want to incorporate a photographic type element, and you can certainly use some of those filters. Now, I didn't plan on showing this, but now that we're here, I want to show you, now that we have this kind of cool looking artwork, I want to show you a little trick in Illustrator. It's image tracing, and it allows you to turn your raster images that you place into Illustrator into vector objects. Pretty cool stuff. So there are many different, and you can customize the setting of your image tracing options. But if you look at my control panel, you should, and your own control panel, and this might be best. It wasn't fair that I didn't drop this in your make it accessible. I was preparing for this. Let me go ahead and do that for you guys. If you guys want to jump right in and move right along, I'll put it right in Images, the Images folder, and this one is 10:01 for today. Happy October. And I'll copy Snowy Mountains into 10:01, and this will give you access to that. So now all of you in the AAD62 server should have access to the snow. It might take a second or two, but should have access to that Snowy Mountain image. And again, to place it into your Illustrator document, simply go to File, Place, and then you'd have to go find it in your I guess it's the TR3 drive. Might be easier if you take a copy of that and move it over into your on your desktop, if it's easier to access from there. But if you guys want to jump into that, see what I had to do here. I had to go TR3. Mine's called AD Share. Yours might be AD62, and then AD62 is the server. Images 10:01, and then you should see Snowy Mountain there, and then you can grab that and place it into your document. Just remember, I prefer, for the most part, to leave the link box unchecked when I'm placing images. That way, if I go to send my artwork, Illustrator artwork, to someone else, they're not like calling me saying, hey, I'm trying to print this, it's rush time, and I don't have this image. After you've imported your image, you can go ahead and click on it. And as I did, I simply applied, boy, now I forget which image trace I applied. Anyone remember which one I selected? Oh no, it wasn't the image trace. We haven't done that yet. It was the effect, artistic, I think it was, what was it? Paint Daubs? Is that the one it was? Palette knife. You guys can, pick whichever one you want. I think this palette knife option works nice because I have big chunks of shapes that, you could almost see, if you were really meticulous about a design project, you could almost see yourself in Illustrator, right? Recreating this one shape at a time. But you guys can certainly go ahead and drop that into an Illustrator file, apply that effect. Has everyone had a chance to do that? Oh, to scale it down? Well, there's a couple of ways. Good question. The way I did it earlier, which may not have been the most efficient way, is I zoomed out by hitting Command minus. I zoomed out, and then with my bounding box on, I grabbed the corners and just scaled it down. Okay? Oh boy, that palette knife. It's going to take a while to do that. Did you get that, Alexis? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Everyone kind of caught up there? The other way to do it, I'll go ahead and undo that. Let me get back to that stage. You have this big giant file. It's bigger than your document, and you're trying to get it to fit real quick. All you need to do is, another way to do it is you can click on it, and in your transform panel, mine is hidden because of the size of my monitor. You guys should probably have an expanded transform panel. But here, I would definitely recommend clicking on the center reference point. Constrain the width and height proportions. I don't know if I've covered this, so maybe it's good for you guys to check this out, but whenever you're changing the width and the height of any object in Illustrator, you can actually constrain the width and the height so that if you change one, the other one changes proportionately or not. And right now, if I were to change the width of this, the height would stay the same because this is unlinked. That's what that, it's a broken link, so these are not linked together. If I click on this button, however, now they are linked together, so if I change one to the width of whatever, boy, my mouse clicked so fast it entered that number for me. But if I change one parameter, let's just say I change this to 8, you should see the height of that object also change proportionately at the same time, and that's nice. 8 by 6, a nice even number. So I'll leave it at that. So did I want to get that kind of two quick ways? If you had something too big, you can always scale it down by clicking on it and transforming it if you need to. Or you can zoom out and then using your bounding box, hold the shift key down to and why would I hold the shift key down if I was using the bounding box?
So it scales both dimensions.
Both dimensions, exactly. So that you scale both dimensions at the same time. Okay. So now we have our 8 by 6 artwork that's had some effect applied to it. Now, all of you guys in your control panel should see this image trace option. And you can click on the little drop-down arrow next to the image trace, and you'll see there are several options here. And these are all things that you really want to play with. We won't have time to obviously go into every one of them. But if I go into high fidelity photo, I'll click that one for now. This might take a while, especially on these iMacs. They're not the most powerful machines, but it's moving along pretty fast. Now it's doing its initial pixel clustering. I like that. I'm going to have to use that. Pixel clustering commence. Yeah, it's taken a while. Okay, so what's going to happen though is we're going to end up with what is going to be almost a complete vector object when everything's said and done by the done work. Oh, that's kind of cool, that effect there. That has a little bit of an emboss kind of feature going on. So again, if you guys apply different effects to your artwork, when you go to do this image trace, you're definitely going to get different results with your artwork, and you could end up with some really cool stuff. This is a real, by the way, you guys, this is really handy. This image trace option, this is really handy stuff for when you do have a photographic element, especially like an object, right? You have like a shoe or a vase or some object, and you want to vectorize it for some reason so that you can maybe create your own colors onto it, turn it into vector shapes because you want to use it as a logo, whatever it might be. This, boy, this has taken a lot longer than I expected on this iMac. It's pretty complex. I didn't think it was that complex after applying this particular filter, but hopefully it's done on this pass. But anyway, back to the object thing. This is what this tool is really excels at, right? Also, you can, if you have a sketch, right, you can take your sketch, scan it in, bring it into Illustrator, and convert that sketched art into vector lines. So now you have your original hand-done sketch that you love, it's been vectorized, and you can take advantage of Illustrator's Illustrator's features.
Would
Yes.
it work as like a stroke and stuff after that?
You have options for that, and I can show you. But you can, you can adjust the options of what Illustrator does with the artwork. You can have it turn into fills. You can have it turn all of the lines to strokes. You can actually control that if you click on that image. Well, it's not there now because it's a process. Okay, so now it looks like it's finished. And if I go into artwork view, you'll see, or outline view. It used to be called artwork view, I think, actually. That's why I keep saying that. But you'll see it still looks like, man, this still looks vector. There's no objects in there. Well, that's because Illustrator is assuming you don't want to do much more with this. You just want to create outlines, and that's it. And it's leaving it as a solid, almost like a compound object. But you can undo that by clicking on this expand button, and lo and behold, I'm still in outline view. If I go over to preview, look at that. This is now all vector, and it looks like that original artwork, and it's all been vectorized. These are all just vector shapes. Yeah.
Do you own the rights to it after you've edited it that much?
Oh boy, that's. I always err on the side of no. Especially a photo like this. I mean, I literally, I pulled this off of Google.
Yeah.
And I didn't check to see what the rights were to the copyright holder. And a photographer could look at this and say, yeah, it's been chunkified. It's been given the old Elizabeth Carmel treatment. Anyone know Elizabeth Carmel, the photographer in town? Some of her photos years back, she applied this filter to all of her beautiful. I was always like, why is she doing that? The photos are beautiful. Why would you glob them up like this? But anyway. I don't know. A photographer could look at that and say, "Yeah, it's different, but that's still my composition." So good question. Those types of things you do want to be, take into consideration when you're trying to create commercial work for sure. I mean, for your own personal stuff, and in this class. Obviously the rules are going to be more lenient. If you were trying to make money off of it, however, I would not do this if I was trying to resell this design. So hopefully that's kind of the simple answer. So you guys, pretty cool feature, that image trace. Hopefully that opens up your mind. Like, oh wow, all right, there's some cool stuff I can do now.
They changed that a bit from CS5. What you can do with it once it's been traced.
Yeah.
It's like a little, I clicked in a box and it came up with that load.
Let me undo a couple of times here. Oh boy, am I going to regret this. Oh, before you expanded it, yeah. There's some other features and options there. Boy, let me undo that. I don't want to go back through all that process. Now it's applying the palette knife. That's okay. I think I want that.
You used to be able to adjust the amount of the threshold and the pixels and that sort of thing.
That should still be an option. Let me go back a few steps. I'm not sure. Oh, there it goes. Yeah, this wouldn't be as tedious if this had a bit of a faster processor. But here we're back to our palette knife effect. If I go to, that's just applying the, let me go and stop that. Let's see here. Where is that? Now, good question. I'm glad you bring this up because I wasn't familiar with what CS6 does in terms of the ability to modify this. Right now, I don't know why this custom option is not shown, but normally that's where you would go to control those options of what happens when you try to trace those. So that's something we can investigate because back to what you were saying or asking about, Christian, if you wanted to create strokes when your artwork came into, I know that in CS5 you were able to, obviously I haven't done this in CS6 much, but I know in CS5 you were able to go right to that control where you would be able to control how many points per, inch, all sorts of parameters, and I'm sure that's still an option that's available here. We'll just have to investigate to figure out, how to get into those. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on real quick onto the gradients thing. Obviously, this image trace stuff I didn't mean to jump into, so it's added a little more time to the lesson here. But just to jump into gradients, relatively quickly. And by the way, if you guys look in Canvas, there's a homework assignment for lesson 10 that I'd like you guys to complete. And again, it's just a reading assignment that you get credits for if you show up on Tuesday. And next Tuesday, we're also going to have a quiz on it on lesson 10. And lesson 10 is going to go more into gradients and radials. But I do want to give you the precursor to that, because gradients and radial gradients are an essential part of designing in Illustrator. And also I want to touch on the gradient mesh tool, which the book doesn't really cover all that extensively. So we all basically know how to do a gradient on an object. I think all of your designs use that to some degree on this last project. And so I've selected my rectangle, I click on the gradient tool, and I apply the black and white gradient right away. I can change that at any time by simply changing the colors that appear in my gradient sliders. And so by double clicking on that slider, it brings up the color panel, or I can switch over to my swatches panel if I like some of those, and I can modify my gradient using these options. That's nothing. Let me get that a little more contrast. That's really nothing new to you guys as far as applying a gradient in that manner, a linear gradient. Now, after you have your gradient applied, you can obviously change the gradient angle, and you could do that in an exact method, by typing in the angle that you want that gradient to appear in the gradient panel, or you can switch over to the gradient tool, and it gives you slightly more granular control, at least visually, of how you can control your gradient. Now what I've done is I've shortened this gradient, the length of it here. You see, if you look at it on screen now the dark purple, or in this case it looks like a really dark blue, but we'll call it purple or indigo here. This point is where that indigo ends, and the rest of it continues to be indigo. So that's what's happening here. And the same thing's happening in this violet area. Right here, the violet is, that violet threshold that has been reached, this color, is right here where that slider is, and beyond that is more of that same violet. So you can actually modify the way your gradients work inside of your object using the gradient tool in conjunction with the gradient panel. Okay, this is going to get a little more complex on radials, but we'll jump to that in a second. You guys can see, I don't know if you saw that, if everyone wants to look up here, if I hover over my gradient slider, indicator on my object, and you notice if I hover over the bottom portion of my gradient, I guess it's called the controller, you'll see that I get a white arrow with a plus, right? So that allows me to add another gradient point right into my artwork at wherever I click. You can also do that here. You can see as soon as I click there, a new slider appeared in my spectrum field here, and I can also add additional sliders here. I mean, you can click a few times, right? So what does that do for you? Well, that allows you to get more intricate gradients. Now, if I click on one of these points in the middle and I change that to orange, I click on another one out here and maybe go green, you see now I'm starting to get, a hippie-looking gradient going on there with a bunch of funky colors in there, a little disco. So, and that's how I think you guys have already kind of explored the linear gradients and some of the options that appear there. You can also change the opacity of a specific slider if you want it to not be full density by simply adjusting clicking on the slider itself and changing the opacity. And you can see I kind of have this little pixel grid pattern that shows me, oh, that's not 100% solid. And so if there's something behind it, you can kind of see. It's hard to see because of the color combination, but if you look at the artwork here, it's kind of starting to pull some of that gray from that background box into the foreground because that blue slider is not at 100% opacity. So there are a few different options that you have with linear gradients. So I'm going to undo a couple of steps to where I get back to just a two-color gradient to quickly demonstrate radials here, radial gradients. So I have a nice subtle gradient. I'm going to draw it back straight across from edge to edge so that the colors blend completely from one to the other inside of the object. And while my object is still selected, I can click on the type of gradient, and this drop-down box basically has two options, either linear or radial. And if I switch over to radial, now I have a radial gradient, one that goes from the inside out. Clicking on the object again, I can reverse the direction of that gradient real quick by clicking on the reverse gradient button inside of the gradient panel. So if you guys want to move along with that, you click on it, and you'll see now the violet is on the outside, at least in my case it's violet, and the indigo is on the inside. So that's a really quick way to sort of demonstrate how that works. And what's happened sometimes when you're working with radial gradients, any gradient for that matter, is you end up drawing multiple objects. Here I'm just drawing additional rectangles, and they all have a radial gradient applied inside of each one independently. If you select them all and go to the gradient tool now, you can see that each one of these independently has its own gradient slider controller. Okay? Everyone kind of following along with that? Because this is a really kind of an important feature for you guys realizing that you don't have to stick to trying to manipulate gradients inside of independent objects when you want a gradient to be consistent throughout. Now, what I'll do is I'll redraw my gradient slider. I'm holding the Shift key down with all three objects selected. I'll redraw my gradient slider going across these objects, and now you see there's only one gradient slider for all three of these objects. And my starting point for the radial is on that first one, and that color blends across all three objects independently. Together as a single gradient, still moving across multiple objects. Sean, I see you working with circles on radials, and that's really a great place to use radials. I'll show you in a second. I'm glad you demonstrated that because I wanted to give you guys a quick peek at how gradients can really create a cool effect. I'm going to change a slider over here on this side over to a really light color. Heck, I'll make it 10% gray. Okay, and now I'm going to switch over to my gradient tool. Now I've applied a gradient where the endpoint is almost white. I think it's 10% gray. And now I'm going to switch over to my gradient tool, and you can see by default Illustrator has the gradient going from the center all the way out to the outer edge. Now, if you want to create sort of a three-dimensional sphere, you can click in the top left corner. A lot of times you'll see light coming in from the top left. I don't know, I think Michelangelo might have been the one who started that. But from the top left is kind of where we're accustomed to seeing stuff. Now, if I click and drag that gradient from that point, you can see now I've got this sphere, three-dimensional sphere that I've created, which is a great way to create a sort of a three-dimensional object without having to jump into the 3D tools. And now I can even add another point here to extend add an additional color as necessary. That's not quite looking like what I want it to. So I'm going to redraw the gradient going out. It's still not quite right. But anyway, you guys get the idea. I'd have to tweak with that a little bit. You can see now I've created this sphere just by taking advantage of that radial gradient on a circular object, an ellipse. It wouldn't quite have the same effect on a square because the radial isn't following the contour of the circle. So, but you can still obviously, the way these three render down here, a nice subtle, there's really, even on this darker projection here, there's a nice subtle transition that's happening there. So keep that in mind as you work with gradients. You can actually apply a single gradient across multiple objects and that sort of thing. Now let's go back to this radial gradient. Hopefully you guys are all have explored that radial gradient inside of the sphere. And if it doesn't look the same way, that's fine. Whatever colors you're using, that's okay. But what I want to demonstrate is when it comes to the radial gradient, you have a few more options that appear when you are when you click on your gradient tool. So go ahead and click on your object, and then click on your gradient tool, and you'll again get the gradient controller. But if you hover over that object, or basically anywhere within the perimeter of that gradient controller, you see this dotted circle that appears, right? Well, these different points allow you to do different things. The black point on the outer edge allows you to create oval shapes and modify the width of your radial so it doesn't have to remain a perfect circle. So if you click on that black square and move it in and out, you'll see my radial now has changed to be more of an oval, and I can push it back out if it's not that evident because the gradient is blown off of the edges here. But you can actually change the angle of your gradient by radial gradient by using those. This outer one allows you to scale the gradient quickly right within. It's not looking as cool as it was before, but you can see I've done some significant changes to my radial gradient using that tool. And then lastly, if you hover just outside, it's a little tricky, but if you hover just outside of the scale dot, you should see a rotation icon. Your icon should turn into a little rotation symbol, and that'll allow you to rotate the gradient and change the direction, which of course is similar to having rotated the angle here in the gradient panel, as well as changing the aspect ratio, which we did, which is basically making it more of an oval. You can do that in the panel as well, but it's often helpful to use these visual tools so you can see what's happening as you. This might be a good way to draw the planet Jupiter here if you were to take advantage of this tool. Okay, so that's a little bit on gradients. And again, lesson 10 is going to cover a lot more, or about the same stuff, but it's going to get you guys in the habit of practicing more with multiple objects, using those gradients across multiple objects, and a few other things. So let's jump into real quick here, because I do want to get a break in here today. Let's go ahead and jump into the gradient mesh tool. Oh, this tool can be really fun. I want to show you guys something that was created using a gradient mesh tool. And let me jump back over to my folder here, desktop, and all right. This piece here was created using the gradient mesh tool. Now, from a distance for you guys, that might look pretty intricate, right? Looks pretty photorealistic. Well, this was designed using solely the gradient mesh tool, and I'll show you how that works. It takes a lot of time. I mean, it's like painting basically. Maybe without practice, it takes longer than painting if you're a good painter. You just get paint and kind of start creating the colors. But it's much like painting. It does take time, but you can certainly create and render some really fascinating custom-looking artwork using the gradient mesh tool. In this demonstration, obviously due to the lack of time, we're not going to get extremely intricate with the design. I just want to show you how, and I think you'll get the gist of how those pieces of that boot were created. But basically, with an object selected, if you go over to this, I guess it's called the mesh tool. I think it used to be called the gradient mesh tool, but now it's called the mesh tool. If you click on that one time, you can then click on your object and start adding gradient mesh points anywhere in your object. I've clicked on and I've added a grid. Now, so far that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it will in a moment. I'm going to undo that and show you what happens. Whoops. What happens if I double click on the gradient mesh tool? Oh, maybe not. Oh, I have to click on my object. Double click on the gradient mesh tool. All right, some things have moved around on me. That's all right. We'll stick to the this pattern for now. This is actually what's going to give you the most control on how to colorize objects using the gradient mesh tool. So right now I've added. I'll go back to adding those points, and you can add them anywhere. And obviously, the more points you add, the more complex your object's going to get. But what are all these points good for? Well, now I can actually apply color to each of these individual points. So if I click on the point with my direct selection tool, has to be the direct selection tool, because if I use my selection tool, it's going to select the whole object. But I've selected on a single point with my direct selection tool. Now I can change the color of that one point, and now I'm clicking on different ones, and I'm starting to add some depth and shading to this object just by changing. And I'm working all in grays here, nothing exciting really, but you can see how now I'm starting to create sort of this nebulous illustrated texture going on inside of here. And every point you click on, you can totally manipulate the color. And now you see Illustrator has drawn what looks like to be sort of an airbrushed kind of pattern in there.
How many points do you think that one with the shoe has on it?
That's a good question. By the way, I pulled this image off of Toots Plus, which is a great site, TUTS PLUS. If you guys ever want to jump on it, I mean, you can YouTube great demo videos. But this particular, I think, I don't know how many the overall boot did, but I think the sole, just that sole edge of right along here, I mean, could have probably been done with using the right colors. I don't know, using a couple dozen or so points, but you really have to play with the colors to get those to blend just right, because obviously there were some dark points in here, but then there was a transition that had to be relatively smooth there. And so...
do you think he's working, or he or she is working off a photograph?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So they've got a picture.
They have a photo on that they've imported into Illustrator, and they're actually tracing over the photo and trying to... And remember how we used the eyedropper? Probably using the eyedropper to pull colors and everything. So... you can. There's another method. I mentioned the image tracing earlier, but this is another method whereby you can create photorealistic looking art using the gradient mesh tool. Excuse me. And then the beauty of this is once it's created, it's still all vector, so you can continue to reshape and move all of these individual points in different directions to really start to create rendered objects that look, that could even have a photorealistic look, right? Using the gradient mesh tool. Any questions on that? Any additional questions?
How can you modify the gradient itself when you use that? Is that also modified through
The overall color, if I go to the selection tool as opposed to the direct selection tool, I can change the color of all of those points at one time, right? So in other words, if I was trying to draw that boot with brown, I might start with a gradient mesh that looks like this, and then go in and add the different points of darker shades, lighter shades of brown to get that to render correctly. I don't know, does that answer your question, Alicia? But there's no, this is a, and maybe that's why they got rid of that term gradient mesh, because it's not really, it creates gradient effects, but it's not like the linear gradient where you have a transition from one color to the other and then, okay, I see. Now, whether you can apply a gradient to a meshed object, you can't do it. It's designed to, see, I'm trying to apply a gradient to that. I've got the object selected entirely using the selection tool, and if I click on that black and white gradient, it won't do it because this is a mesh object. It's designed for you to go in and basically paint your colors into there. Now, without a lot of practice, this isn't going to seem all that exciting. It's just going to get blobby. But that's why I wanted to show you at least a real-world example of what you can do with a tool like this if you really want to get intricate with your design. All right, why don't we go ahead and take a quick break. If you guys wouldn't mind, another 7. It seems like 7's our lucky number. We'll be back at 5 till 8, and we'll try to get through some additional stuff here. Yeah. All right. Oh, thanks for listening. Don't want to lose that. So now I got to figure that out. Oh, Tom took off. I got to figure out how you customize the what was that? The image. And continue to pick up on stuff. So I'll take this star that we've created now and I'll slide it over to the other side of my 10 by 10 square document or artboard. And I'll click on this one and change the color to something obvious like a lime green. And now I'm going to use the blend tool to create a blend between those two objects. And in order to do that, you have to select them both, right? And then once they're both selected, you can double click on the blend tool. And you'll see by double clicking on that blend tool, it brought up the dialog box to control how this blend is going to work. And you'll see that there are a few different options here. I have smooth color, which by the way, if you can select what you want to do here. And I want this to be a demonstration on smooth color, so I'll go ahead and leave the smooth color option selected so that I know that that is what's going to be applied here. I can always change it after the fact. So now, when I click on these two objects, if you click on the same point from one object to the other, still on the blend tool here, I'll just click on this top point of the first one and then the top point of the second one, and you can see Illustrator has now created the blends to try to render a smooth color transition from one object to the other. The reason it did smooth color was because that was the option that I selected when I first opened up that blend tool dialog box. Okay, everyone got that? If you, this is like an effect in that if I go into outline, outline view, you can see that I basically have my two stars are the only objects there, and all of those blends Illustrator is rendering in sort of phantom mode, I suppose. But Command Y will bring me back to preview mode, and you can see how that's applied. Now, with both of those objects and not only the objects itself, but my path that's creating that blend between the two, with both of those selected, I can double click on the blend tool. It'll bring back my dialog box, and I can change the way that actually works. If I don't want it to simply be smooth color, say for instance, I want to control the number of steps between, right now it's rendering 152, but say I only want 2 steps in between there, I can click on the preview button, and you'll see now I've managed to change the number of steps, only 2 steps in between those objects, by going back to the blend options dialog box and changing that there. My preview allows me to see what's going on. Same thing as before. If I go into outline view, you'll see that I still just have those 2 stars, and Illustrator's rendering the rest. So that's one way to use the blend tool. Lastly, if I double click on the blend tool again to open up the dialog box, I can not only adjust the specific steps, but the specific distance between those steps. So if you really need this to be precise, like you want those stars, say they're a lot smaller or whatever shape you're working with, if it's a lot smaller and you want those things to be exactly a 1/4 inch apart, you can set those parameters within the blend options dialog box. All right, so that's one way to use it. I think I hit cancel, and that's why it reverted back to what I had. I'll go ahead and draw another set of stars here below. Maybe this time a little smaller. I'm going to click and Option Shift drag to create a duplicate over to the other side of my screen. And I'm going to take one of these, I'm going to rotate it, let's just say 45 degrees. So all I did was I clicked on it, and because my blending options are, or my bounding box is on, I was able to just quickly rotate that. So now I have those 2. Same color though, they're not a different color. And what I can do here is, again, select both of those objects, click on my blend tool, and now you notice I don't have the same reference point for that star. It's been rotated. Well, I can still try to get that star to blend over to that same point here, and when I finish that, well, because I've got color mode still selected, it's created this really funky looking blend going on here. But if I double click on blend options and change this to a specific number of steps and reduce that to something like 10, now I can see that Illustrator, maybe less so we can get a better look at those stars. You can see that Illustrator is actually rotating that star as it goes along to get to that finished shape. It's doing that automatically for you. So this is a really neat way to get different objects to transition from one to the other. And obviously, these shapes could have been very different, and Illustrator could still transform them. So to demonstrate that, by hitting the L key, I will bring up my ellipse tool. I'll shift Option click to draw my ellipse from the center out, perfectly circular. And I will try to use the blend tool again. Again, I'm going to select both my objects by shift clicking on them both, and I'll click on one point and then the next, and Illustrator has now attempted to draw a blend between those. I'll change my steps again to something like 6. I'll do a preview, and you can see what Illustrator is trying to do there on your behalf, right? It's taking that star and pushing the shape over into something different. All right, everyone got that? Is that pretty straightforward stuff? Kind of a cool tool to get into for. I'm going to go ahead and apply this blend, and I'm going to show you that you can actually have a blend change along a path. So this path is here for a reason. It's here to sort of dictate the direction that this blend happens. And I'm going to add another anchor point. You can see it works just like any other anchor any other path when I hover over it with my pen tool. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, I switched over to my pen tool, by the way, because it's a path, so I can manipulate it like another, any other path in Illustrator. I switched over to my pen tool. I quickly did that by hitting the P key. That brings up your pen tool quickly, keyboard shortcut there. And now I am going to grab just that point, hopefully, by using the direct selection tool. And this keyboard shortcut, this is where things get really fancy. I don't know if I've demonstrated this many times, but if you hold down Command Option and hit Tab, look at that, it toggles between my selection and my direct selection tool. And then now, if I hold down the Command key, it brings up my direct selection tool as opposed to the selection tool. If that's too much for you, you can always just click on the direct selection tool, grab that point. I'm going to move it out here, and you can see I've changed the direction that blend is attempting to function. It's still following that path.
What's that keyboard shortcut?
So, pretty complex stuff. It's actually a combination of stuff, a combination of commands. So, in order to bring up my, so what happened was, when I was hitting my Command key, it was bringing up my selection tool, right? And that's the default, because most of the time you want to grab your entire object and manipulate it, right? But in order to do a keyboard shortcut, and this is again really handy when you're working with paths, because sometimes if you click away from the path, it'll reset the points that you're drawing on. So the keyboard shortcut you first need to do to get over to the selection side is Command Option Tab. And now you see it's switched over to where if I hold down the Command key, after doing that, after toggling over to the direct selection tool, now when I hold the Command key, it brings up the direct selection every time. I've changed that permanently as I'm working on this document. If I want to switch back over to make that the selection tool, I just do Command Option Tab again, and now you can see when I hit Command, it brings up the selection tool. I know that's a lot to follow, and these keyboard shortcuts in Illustrator can get very intricate. So, any questions on that keyboard shortcut? I know it's a little tricky, but it's worth knowing that. Nice artwork you got going there, Sean. Digging that. So yeah, you can certainly control your keyboard or your selection tool without ever leaving the pen tool. That's the main thing. If you want to move your whole object around, you can toggle back over to your selection tool, and now if I grab it and move it, it's going to move the entire object. If I Command Option Tab, it's going to shift over to my direct selection tool. So now I can just quickly, without having really left my pen tool, manipulate just a single point on the path. All right. So enough on that. We are going to move on to the upcoming and ensuing design project. I hope you guys were able to follow along during this. This isn't a lab assignment. You don't need to save this file. You're not turning this one in. This was just one of those lectured kind of demo that you guys hopefully were able to follow along with and gain some additional tools in your arsenal. Once you complete lesson 10, I think you'll definitely have a greater and more in-depth understanding of all of the tools that we've covered here. So again, we're going to be quizzing on it next Tuesday. So I want you guys to jump into that and get something out of it, especially with the upcoming design project that we have. Okay, let me turn the lights back on here, and I've got a handout for you. The design project is already available in Canvas as design project number 2, and there's the PDF link in there. But I'll go ahead and give you guys a handout here. You'll have them coming around. Christian. Okay. Divvied them up a little off there. But while we have this on screen, I do want to demonstrate something here. Super basic stuff, because this will apply to the design. I have a black rectangle on my screen, and let's see. I am going to, oh, thanks. Everyone get one over there? You got some extras? Thank you. All right. So, if you look at this, and I know the lights are on, it's a little hard to see, but it's high contrast, so it should be okay. Does that look like it's in the exact center to you? Does it, I mean, just looking at it, does it look like the exact center? Yeah? Does everyone feel like it looks like the exact center? That is, what's that?
I don't know.
What does it feel like?
I think it's just because you're asking the question. My brain's like messing with the image and I'm like having trouble. I can't give an answer, I guess.
You can't give an answer because I'm tricky that way. Well, the answer is yes, it is in the exact center. However, objects don't always appear that way when they are placed on a page, especially when you're framing artwork, like you guys, when you guys do that, right? When you're gluing or adhering your designs onto that black paper. We've been working with large designs, right? So it's okay that you know it's placed right in the center of the document. But have you guys ever noticed picture frames? You ever notice picture frames if they're rectangular? Sometimes the mat boards inside of them, the bottom part of the mat is bigger than the top. It's a little thinner on the top. Well, I know this isn't the greatest visual. If I had actually, there's some picture frames in here. I wonder if they're set up that way. I don't know if they're rectangular, but you guys will be using these for an upcoming project. I'll show you. And I might be wrong, but with these particular frames, but oftentimes if you get artwork, oh gosh, I have so many keys on here. Let's see. It's not that one. There we go. All right. So let's see here if this indeed holds true. These, because these are so small, they don't do that, and it usually happens on larger artworks. But basically, what I was talking about was oftentimes, especially with larger pieces or larger mats. This is the mat board of the frame. A lot of times, you'll see that the top one is slightly smaller or not as thick as the bottom one. And the reason for that, as the mat gets bigger, what starts to happen, in other words, as this artboard is getting bigger, what starts to happen is gravity starts to take effect on your eyes. And what happens is this square starts to actually look like it's lower than center. You can look at this and almost feel like, if you really stare at it, you can kind of see where it might feel like it's not quite center, like it's hanging just slightly low, even though it's in the exact center. So the reason I'm talking, or I'm bringing this up is, when you guys present your logo design projects for this upcoming project, and I've given you the handout there, you're going to be mounting a 6x6 inch, rendition of your logo on the 8.5 by 11 black mat board. And if you were to put that smack dab in the center, if you measured it out, you got the center, and you divided the distance from the top and the bottom, and you knew it was exact center. If you held that up, you might find that it seemed like it was a little low, even though you know it's an exact center. And the reason for that is gravity does have an effect, and things tend to, not always, but they tend to feel lower than exact center if indeed they are positioned in the exact center. So all of this, I'm mentioning it because whenever I mount artwork, or even in designing, if this were to be a logo floating in the middle of my rectangle, I would probably move this slightly up so that visually it starts to feel like, hey, okay, now it feels a little more balanced in there, because gravity is it's actually not centered anymore, but gravity is having an effect on this object and telling your brain to pull it down. And so by placing it slightly above center, we have what's now called visual center. And that's all. There's no exact formula for it. It really is just a sort of an optical phenomenon that happens. Something to keep in mind when you're mounting artwork. You're also in this design project going to be So this design project is about two different things. It's about designing a logo, as I mentioned earlier, for yourself. And the portion that is the symbol, when I mention symbol in here, it's not symbols from Illustrator, where you just snap one of those symbols and use it as your own. That's not what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to create artwork for this, okay? So the symbol just means the symbol. That is going to be present in your artwork. And I'll show you guys some examples of logo designs that I just pulled up, maybe that serve as inspiration, but you guys probably have already found websites that have and can serve as inspiration for you guys independent of that. The other thing, the other part of this project is creating a business card, okay? So standard size business card, it can be vertical orientation or horizontal landscape, but I want everyone to do a 3.5 inch, and it's all specced out on here, 3.5 inch wide by 2.5 inch high, or 3.5 by 2.5, whichever. By 2, I'm sorry, 3.5 by 2 are the dimensions. Whether you want to be a vertical card or a horizontal is up to you, but I want you guys to design a business card. So why this project? What's the big deal? Well, business cards, some people say they're becoming obsolete, right? But not until you can actually beam, from one phone to the other, or one brain to the other, the information. Business cards are a handy tool, and they are. I didn't want to go through a project where you guys were designing the stationery and the whole letterhead and an envelope, which is kind of a traditional thing. But a business card is certainly something that you might still find yourself designing as a piece for either a customer or yourself, right? What I want you guys to think about in this project is, of course, be creative. Have this be a representation of you or a fictitious business, or if you're already kind of working under a fictitious business name for maybe hobby design or commercial design that you're doing, feel free to consider this an opportunity to explore some ways to create an identity for you or your business. But I also want you guys to explore the stuff you've learned in illustration, right? Illustrating the symbol itself, and then working with type, the logo type itself. And that can be your name or this business thing. And then creating a business card for that. And hopefully, when you're done with this, right, you'll have a business card that you can hand out to people when you want to give out your information. Now, you're not obligated to put your, I suggest your phone number, email, you can put your address on there, web address if you have one. You're more than welcome to do that. It's not a requirement. I mean, if you don't want to divulge your personal information on the card, you can make up fictitious business information and phone numbers and stuff if you want. Little disclaimer there. So, any questions on the design project? Pretty straightforward. Think creative. You guys, if you look at the grading criteria, you'll see that a big chunk of it is the creativity part. And when the project is a logo, which is relatively small compared to the bigger flyers that allow for more creative opportunity, this is where your sketches and your creative thinking should really shine, right? And if you want to present more than one logo, say you do 3, because you're like undecided. I personally have designed 11 logos for my own business, and I'm still not satisfied with the current one. So if you have more than one, you can feel free to present multiple options to demonstrate your creative thought process in this project. So what I wanted to show you guys with the few minutes that we have left are some mounting techniques. Since we are going to be doing smaller printed pieces, and I'm going to bring up, this is actually one of the current versions of the logo that I've designed for my own. I kind of tweaked the business card just to create this example, but this is kind of a logo that I designed for my business. It's kind of hard to see in the dark. That's okay, because there's a lot going on. But I have a photographic element in the background, and then I have this illustration that I created for it, and I wanted some of these things to be very monochromatic. And so, but this meets the criteria. I have type where I've created a linear shadow. I've got a colorized logo that shows intricate design. I have several sketches as part of the process for all this, and of course I rendered this globe and added some effects. But I didn't bring this up to show off work. I just wanted to kind of show you a printing process. When you go to print in, and you guys will, I assume, is anyone not going to be printing their stuff here in class? Maybe. Okay, some of you might be printing elsewhere to kind of get it done or whatever. Well, regardless of that, the printing options, this print dialog box, and I'm going to go to half-light so that maybe you can see that a little better. Can everyone kind of see that? Okay. The print options are going to pretty much be the same for you. The only thing that's going to change is obviously the name of the printer. Within the output options for Illustrator's print dialog box, there is a marks and bleeds option. You might want to take notes on this if you don't have the photogenic memory. But if you look here, you have this marks and bleed option in there. And if you click on that, it changes all of the attributes that were on the right-hand side. And all you need to do is hit all printers marks. Okay? Need a pen? I have an extra one. And this is going to be in the video, by the way. I'm recording this, so if you want to reference that. If you guys look up here again, you'll see my preview shows where my marks shows that it's going to end up creating marks and bleeds for this artwork that allow me to trim it so that my artwork bleeds beyond the edges of the pages. You guys might not want to do that. Your artwork might all fit inside with a white background, and that would be fine as well. But in this case, I chose to add additional presentation value to the logo by creating a background for it that kind of bleeds off the edges of the page. And so now we'll go ahead and start that print because it's going to take a few moments. Hopefully this thing has enough RAM to crank it out. Sometimes I've found it to not be be able to print out some of these bigger files. But basically you can see what I've done here with my artwork. Everyone can see where my art board is, right? It's a 6 by 6 inch square. You can kind of see those black lines. And my artwork extends beyond the edges of that, okay? And now, when I go to look at my printout, I notice, wait, something didn't go quite right here. If you look at that, you'll see that my crop marks are right on the edge of my artwork. And it's like, wait a minute, that's not quite what I wanted, right? I wanted my artwork to extend beyond the borders of the print so that I could actually have something extra to trim off. So the reason for that is my document was not prepared for that printing. You actually have to apply the bleed to your document for the bleed to appear on the print. And to do that, you go into document setup, which we've covered. I think the second or third week when we're working with artboards. And if you go into document setup, you'll notice at the very top there's an option to apply bleed to your artwork. And in the assignment, you'll see that I've asked for 1/8 of an inch or 0.125 amounts of bleed. So I want to see that when you guys turn, because you'll be turning in your files in addition to, of course, the printouts. I want to see that you guys have applied an 1/8 inch of bleed at least all the way around your artwork. That's going to be one of the criteria. So to do that, I will hit 0.125 here, and now when I go back to my artboard, you'll see Illustrator has rendered this red line, and that's indicating to me how much bleed it's going to print now when it prints this artwork out. And so if I hit that, print again, marks and bleeds are still selected because it remembered that from the previous print options. I'll go ahead and try printing that again, and this time you'll see that I did it correctly. and I should end up with bleeds extending beyond the edges of the crop marks there. And you'll see, maybe should have waited for this one, hon, so you could pass them both side by side and compare the difference. But now if you look at this one, the crop marks there are, the artwork that I printed is extending beyond those trim marks and crop marks that are rendered on this printed page that's coming around. So, I'll print another one just to maybe start on the other side. So you see the difference between the two there? How that bleed does, that bleed setting in your document does affect the way your artwork prints. And I'll show you in a second why that's kind of important. We're doing pretty good on time here. Yeah, I'll start one from this side here. So you can remember the difference from what we had in the previous version. Now you can see that artwork is extending beyond those trim marks. All right, so I'm going to try to set up a decent work area here somewhere. Maybe I'll move this scanner over a little bit, and we'll kind of bug you over here, Christian. Just don't want to crash into the computer. So if you guys want to kind of gather around the table here, I'll show you guys a little bit about a technique for trimming artwork and why bleed is important to have. So either one of those with bleed will work. Okay. So now this is a cutting board. A lot of times what I used was just, if I didn't have a cutting board like this, the back of my sketch book, at least some of the cheaper ones have that thick cardboard on the back, or cardboard itself works really well. Can also work, especially throwaway pieces. Obviously, you can use. And metal straight edges tend to be. I forgot I stole this from my friend Teresa back in college. Teresa. But the boy, that's been around a long time. It's fun. Anyway, so metal straight edges are the best, obviously, so you don't cut through the ruler. If it's a wooden ruler with a wooden edge, you might cut through it, or plastic. I try to use plastic, and all of a sudden you gouge into the plastic. So if you can find a metal edge, that's obviously the best thing. I've also found myself in my garage, picking up different tools or things that have long, straight metal edges. So there are a few different options. But basically, and then any knife, I happen to have an X-Acto knife with the number 11 blade. This is one that I use for when I'm creating mock-ups and stuff. But any utility knife will work. A lot of times, what's really convenient these days, if you want to pick yourself up one for class for doing stuff like this, are those breakaway ones. You can find them at the hardware store, or even at Rite Aid or whatever, for relatively cheap. And the blades kind of break off when they get dull. You can snap off the tips. You guys might have seen those around, so you can use those. But the most important thing with trimming your artwork is safety, right? I've actually seen someone just slice the tip of their thumb right off, and it just pulled up with blood, and I almost fainted because I had this adversity at the sight of blood. And but anyway, it can happen. So the thing that's most important is you just make sure that your fingers are out of that; they're not hanging over the edge of the straight edge, and you'll be okay. So what I usually do is I put my knife down right on the line that's closest to me, and I use, because from there I know that is solid. This thing can pivot around, but I know I at least have one very solid edge, right? And then I get the other side lined up so where I see that straight edge right on that line, and then I put pressure down on that straight edge. I have it upside down in this case because this has cork on the bottom. If I had it this way and I tried cutting, the blade could pivot and slice underneath, right? Because that cork is raising that ruler off of the surface. So that's why if you have this type of ruler with something that raises it off the surface, you can do that. You can flip it upside down and use it that way. And so again, I align that. And what you don't want to do is cut all the way across the paper. You don't want to do that. You want to preserve your trim marks. That's what they're there for. So the best thing to do is cut and don't put a lot of pressure. What you want to do is, even on paper this thin, 2 or 3 light cuts are going to give you a much sharper, crisper, tighter edge than if you try to gouge it. Sometimes if you gouge it and it's really bad paper or a dull blade, you can crinkle the paper or just create really chunky cuts. So a few slices are better. And you see I didn't cut all the way across, and then you just rotate your paper and repeat the process and continue along. And every time I do this, I've kind of gotten into the habit, but I look down at my fingers every time, and I make sure they're not hanging over the edge. That's important. And you notice I'm not cutting all the way across the paper. Again, I'm just cutting across the trim marks here. I double check my fingers, I'm all clear there. And I have one more cut to go. That one felt like it only needed 2. And then this last one here will allow me to finish it off. So my thumb was out of the way, that one took 2. So now I can just lift this off, and I've got this trimmed right down, really clean edges, full bleed, because I had full bleed settings, and then I used the trim marks to do that. So, is that new to anyone, or is everyone kind of familiar with that process, or I don't know what.
What's wrong with
The paper cutter, really good question. The paper cutter would work very much like this. If I were to cut all the way across, because this is the only way a paper cutter can cut it. I'm glad I had 2 of these. Now look at these crop marks are gone. I no longer have a reference for this edge up here. And I mean, I can eyeball it. You can kind of say, if you mess up and you're like, oh, I cut all the way across, you can eyeball it and see 1/8 of an inch of cross. But it's not as precise, obviously, as if you preserve that trim mark and continue to use that and trim your artwork out in that manner. This is I don't do mock-ups on brochures all that often anymore, but precise cutting can really come in handy for that. If you're doing a brochure for someone and you're designing it, it has multiple pages and you're kind of using a stapler to assemble it all, those really precise trims will allow you to get really precise design mock-ups. So that's a little bit about that process. And so now, let me grab a sheet of paper. I kind of have one out here. I didn't have black paper, but actually this might look better with the black and white. So now, obviously, you want to position this on your page, measuring the distances so that it's horizontally, it's centered, and then vertically, you can play around with that vertical center that I showed on the screen I was talking about earlier. Because if this was placed right smack dab in the middle, without measuring it, I don't know, but if it was, and when you held it up, it might look like it's a little low. So sometimes you just want to bump it up 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch on something this size, and it'll give you the right amount of visual center. Yeah.
You should have for example, we come up with a design that's darker background.
Mm-hmm.
So do we just use the black still and use that, or do we so it stands out?
You mean like you're not using black, but you're using.
Well, for example, if we have black paper right now, that design will kind of get lost in front of the paper.
Yes.
So
Yes, right. It might, but most of those black. Does anyone have a sample of the black paper? You have some maybe with you? What? The final grade for this class is going to be your overall workbook, okay, and the overall presentation of that. So, the reason I'm mentioning it's probably a good time to mention this now is don't hesitate to redo some things. If you weren't happy with the way maybe some production, if you had crinkled paper in one of your printouts or something, feel free to redo that because when you go in to turn in that workbook at the end of class for the final. I'm going to be looking at production quality on how you mounted your artwork. Presentation is key, right? I mean, all this whole class, I look at it like you guys getting prepared for the real world, right? Where you want to present in real world being a professional graphic design environment where presentation really does matter. As a matter of fact, so much so that with what you're talking about, I would consider taking a Sharpie marker and just running it along the edge of this so that you wouldn't even see that white thin little edge when I mounted it on my black paper. So, those are all things to consider. It's a little risky to run that Sharpie because that ink kind of bleeds and it could bleed on your artwork. But if it's dark enough, it might look good. I mean, those are all little, obviously at this stage I'm not going to be that nitpicky, but that's the kind of thinking that I do. When I set something up for presentation, I want it to be as, I dress like a slob, but I at least want my design work to present somewhat nicely. But anyway, does that kind of answer your question? So back to the black on black. I would prefer that your pieces look consistent throughout your whole book, as opposed to having, white paper, cream paper.
So that would be better than if that's darker.
No, I'm not going to look at that as a negative. No. Yeah, this particular design certainly stands out a lot better on black, but the overall presentation is okay that it's presented this way. I would much rather see a consistent overall presentation.
If we so this project, are you looking for something like a logo position somewhere like this and then text here, or are you looking for a logo as your one page and then another page?
Good question. The only reason I brought this up is because I have this handy, right? Is because it's my own thing. But I'll show you guys examples, and I meant to do that actually a step earlier. And we do have just a minute left. You guys want to sit? Any questions on the production process here? That all kind of makes sense to everyone? Was that helpful?
Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. Sure. Let me pull those up here, and I think I already have them open. Actually, let's see. There they are. So here, these are you guys some examples that I pulled off of the web, just for ideas. I was like, well, I don't have 1,000 different logos that I can show you that were done all vector, but these are all examples of artwork that is all vector, or could be done all vector. Obviously, you remember our Tahoe flyer project, right? There's that sort of radial blend, right, inside of there. Simple circle with dots, the banner. I think it was a week and a half ago we talked about using the type effects, arcing type. Obviously this could be done very, I can't say simply, right? Because part of it was the concept, is the sketching process, developing this idea. What's it going to look like? What do all of these things mean? Why a circle? Those are all some of the ideas that I want you guys to explore. And I saw this one, and Alexis, I thought of yours, right? That little illustration. If you wanted to do something like that for your logo, if you want to get more creative and cartoony with your mark, you can certainly do something like this. And keep in mind, what really makes this design, and it's very subtle things, right? It's proper highlights. That little white edge makes it look like it's rendered, like it has volume. The tapering strokes, bless you. The tapering strokes, these aren't just one point thick outlines. There's a slight taper to them that gives the illustration refinement and volume. And of course, the type choice. This is where I'd like you guys to really jump into using Google Fonts, for free fonts. Also, Dafont, DAFONT.com. We talked about that, I think, the first week of class. Look at some of those fonts, and feel free to use those in your designs, and really get creative with appropriate type choices for your design. Let's see, how do I get to the next one? Page down. No, that doesn't work. Oh boy, I know there's more. Oh, I started at the end. All right, so here's another one. This one has a repeating back. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it has a repeating pattern in the background. And this is where, kind of like what I did with that logo thing that I showed you, I had extra background art work just to enhance the presentation a bit. It's really about the logo, but overall, this slight little, kind of argyle, I don't know if it's argyle or it's kind of a floral pattern back there, works well with this design. And again, the type choice is married up really nice with that, as well as this. We kind of have this slab serif font and a very blocky design. I mean, you guys can look at this and certainly see Illustrator all over that. I mean, I'm sure you guys could look at that and probably at this stage, everyone here could trace that with the pen tool and build it pretty quickly using the tools that you already know how to use. However, the difference being it's the creative concept coming up with that. And that's where your sketches and your essay, this is again going to require an essay too. That's where I want to see that process. I want to hear about your process through your words and through your drawings. All right, well, a couple more and it's time to go. This one, does this qualify? I think so. It's rendered type, but there's some illustrated elements. And quite frankly, of all of these, this is probably the most complex. I'm sure this is a custom font that was drawn, and you can imagine what it would take using the pen tool to try to render something like that. The one on the left is a little more straightforward as an Illustrator design. So again, all of these were just different ideas that I wanted them to be all illustrators so that you guys could see that you can certainly render some really beautiful illustrations. Look at that logo would render gorgeous on any print on it. You could print that make an embroidered thing on a cap even, and it still works as vector. It's really nicely done. This one is very complex, but already with that couple assignments that we did with the mountains and the Tahoe stuff, and some of you guys got into some of these circular shapes. I know Megan, with your teardrop thing, you had some of that stuff already going on, kind of logo style design. There's a lot you can do. So anyway, hopefully that gives you some food for thought for the project. We'll see you guys on Thursday. Thank you.
What's the date for the turning on the project?
15, 2 weeks. So yeah, I advise you, it's